In October of 2010, a loan officer named Clint Barger drove out to the Holt place in Reno County, Kansas, 2 weeks after Gene Holt was in the ground. He came in a white, bank-issued pickup with clean tires on a dry gravel road, and he sat at Ruth Holt's kitchen table with a manila folder and a yellow legal pad, and told her, with measured kindness, that the most sensible course was to list the land, all 600 acres. He said it gently because he meant it gently. He had a degree from Kansas State and 14 years of agricultural lending behind him, and he had seen a dozen farm widows in that time. And he believed what he was telling her. He said the operating lien Gene had been carrying at the time of his death was $280,000. He said the farm, managed in a conventional manner, might net $18,000 a year in a favorable year, and that a $280,000 note did not service itself on $18,000 a year. He said, and his voice held genuine sympathy when he said it, that he understood this felt sentimental. She did not answer him right away. She got up and poured him more coffee. Bess, her 4-year-old red heeler, was asleep under the table pressed against Ruth's left boot, and Ruth reached down once and set her hand flat on the dog's side, the way you touch something that does not require explanation. 26 months later, in December of 2012, Clint Barger sat at that same table with a different folder. Ruth had called and asked him to come. She handed him a lien statement she had printed at the Reno County Courthouse that morning before he arrived. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, the way a person looks at a number that has rearranged their understanding of something. $61,247.18. 2 winters, no acres sold, no outside investment, no restructuring agreement signed at the bank's oak veneer table. The story of how that happened is the story of what Gene Holt had been writing in a spiral-bound ledger since 1994, what Ruth already understood, and what a system built to measure only what fits in a column consistently fails to account for. Gene Holt had farmed 600 acres in the southern part of Reno County for 31 years. He had bought the home quarter from his father in 1979 and added ground over time, always slowly, always without debt he could not see the end of. He was known for 2 things in Nickerson and the surrounding townships, for being quiet in a way that made people think he was slow, and for growing wheat that nobody around him grew anymore. Turkey Red, an heirloom variety brought to central Kansas by Mennonite settlers from the Crimean region in the 1870s. Deep-rooted, winter-hardy, low-yield by modern standards, the kind of wheat the Extension Office had been counseling farmers away from since the 1950s. Gene planted 180 acres of it every year on the same ground his father had planted, and he kept the rest of the farm in native pasture and a rotating fallow system he had worked out over 15 years of soil observation. The fallow rotation struck his neighbors as eccentric. It struck the county extension agent, a man named Bart Klein, who visited the farm twice in 20 years, as a waste of tillable ground that could be generating income. Gene had started a ledger in 1994 and never stopped. By the time he died of a stroke on a cool morning in early October, the ledger had filled 4 spiral-bound notebooks stacked on the corner of his desk, and inside them were soil temperature readings taken at 6-inch and 12-inch depths across different soil blocks, dated rainfall measurements, germination observations going back 16 years, notes on which soil blocks responded to which rest intervals, records of organic matter content in fields tested in 2001 and again in 2007, and in the back pages of the 3rd and 4th notebooks, names, phone numbers, buyers in Kansas City and Wichita and Emporia, a regional stone grinding mill in the east part of the state that had been calling Jean twice a year for 3 years. Notes on what those buyers were looking for, what they had indicated they would pay, and what Jean had said in reply. Jean had been building something, patiently and without fanfare, the way he did everything. He had not discussed it with Clint Barger because Clint Barger had not asked, and Jean did not explain himself unless someone asked. He had started keeping the ledger the year Ruth's mother died, the year the two of them sat up late in the farmhouse, going through what they owned and what they owed and what they wanted the farm to become. Jean had written at the top of the first page, in the same careful block letters he used for everything, a single line. What the ground needs and what the ground gives back. He had not meant it as a slogan. He had meant it as a research question. He spent the next 16 years answering it. Ruth knew. She had sat at the desk beside Jean on winter evenings for 31 years and listened while he talked through his reasoning. She had seated alongside him. She had helped hand-select the turkey red seed stock each fall, pulling heads that showed good development and setting them aside in cloth bags her mother-in-law had sewn. The same bags Jean's mother had used before her. Ruth had understood for a long time that what Jean was doing out in those fields was not sentiment and not stubbornness. It was arithmetic. It required a longer view than a bank's quarterly planning horizon could hold, and it required a belief that what a soil and a variety could do together, given sufficient time and sufficient rest, would eventually be worth more than the sum of input costs and commodity prices. She had believed it before Jean died. She believed it afterward. The question was whether she could make Clint Barger believe it before he filed something she could not undo. Let me tell you about turkey red wheat, because what follows will not make sense without it. Turkey red is a hard red winter wheat variety, planted in the fall and harvested in early summer, the traditional Kansas cropping calendar going back to the Homestead area. It was the variety that made Kansas wheat country, the grain that fed the United States through the early 20th century and the First and Second World Wars, and the grain that the post-war agricultural system largely pushed aside beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s and 1970s with the development of higher-yielding, semi-dwarf varieties bred specifically for fertilizer uptake and combine efficiency. Those modern, semi-dwarf varieties are genuinely productive under the right conditions. 50 to 70 bushels an acre on irrigated or high-input dryland ground, depending on rainfall and nitrogen program. They are bred for volume, and in a high-input, commodity price world, volume is what the math rewards. The grain goes to the elevator at whatever the Board of Trade is paying that day, which in a normal central Kansas year averages somewhere between $5 and $7 a bushel. And the margin between input cost and sale price is thin enough that a grower needs every bushel an acre will produce to make the operation work. Turkey red in good Kansas ground will yield 25 to 32 bushels an acre without irrigation and without a high nitrogen program. By commodity elevator math, that is a losing proposition. You are producing fewer bushels of grain worth the same price per bushel, and your margin goes negative. This is the arithmetic that drove turkey red off the Kansas landscape over 60 years. This is the arithmetic that Bart Klein, the extension agent, used when he told Jean in 2001 and again in 2006 that the heritage wheat was a hobby and that Jean was leaving yield on the table with every season he planted it. The arithmetic Clint Barger ran in his folder that October morning was the same arithmetic. Neither man had run the other arithmetic because the other arithmetic required a buyer Jean had not yet signed a contract with when he died. Turkey red grain has a protein content that runs 2 to 4 percentage points higher than most modern hard red varieties. The gluten network in the flour is extensible and strong in a way that bakers who work with heritage grains describe as more forgiving than commercial flour, better for long fermentations, more complex in flavor and color. The bran-to-germ ratio differs in ways that matter to mills, doing whole grain or high extraction milling. Artisan bakeries, specialty flour mills, and farm-to-table restaurants in urban markets had been searching for reliable, consistent sources of turkey red wheat since the early 2000s and finding very few, because the commodity system had efficiently removed the supply. What remained was scattered and inconsistent. The right buyer would not pay $5 to $7 a bushel for turkey red. The right buyer would pay a premium to have a guaranteed, consistent supply. Jean had written a figure in pencil in the margin of the fourth notebook, beside the name Paul Engel and a phone number with a 620 area code, $18.50 per bushel. That was what Paul Engel, the regional purchasing director for Engel Mills in Emporia, had offered on the phone in September of 2010, 3 weeks before the stroke took Jean at the east fence line on a Tuesday morning. Jean had not had time to go to Emporia and sign anything. The offer was in pencil in a notebook on a desk in a farmhouse in Reno County, and Clint Barger had not seen it. Ruth found the number in November. She sat alone at the kitchen table with Jean's fourth ledger open under the overhead light, Bess on the rug beside the wood stove, and she read it 3 times. She did not cry when she found it. She recognized it. She had heard Jean mention Engel Mills, heard him say the number once in passing, and the number had been in her mind the way things are in your mind when you have been paying attention for a long time. She copied Paul Engel's name and phone number onto a separate piece of paper. She set the paper on top of the ledger. She went to bed. She called him the next morning. He remembered Jean immediately. He said he was sorry to hear about Jean's passing, that Jean had been one of the most knowledgeable people he had spoken with in the heritage grain business, that he had not met many farmers willing to think 10 years out about a buyer relationship. He said he had been hoping to get Jean's signature on something before the season ended. He asked if Ruth intended to plant the winter wheat that fall. She said the seeding was already in. She had done it herself the week of the funeral because the timing did not allow for grief to interrupt it, and because she understood that the wheat going into the ground that October was what the following summer's conversation with the bank would depend on. There was a pause on the line. He said he would like to come and see the ground in the spring. She said she would be here. The winter of 2010 and 2011 was the kind of quiet that follows a major disruption and feels less like peace than like held breath. Ruth managed the farm through it the way Jean had managed it, checking the winter wheat emergence in December, monitoring the soil temperature readings that Jean had tracked at the same spots, along the same fence lines for 16 years, entering her own numbers in the 5th notebook she had bought at the hardware store in Nickerson the week after she found the ledger. She kept his format. She did not try to improve it. The format was part of what he had learned, and she was not going to discard it because it looked simple. Clint Barger came back in March of 2011. He had revised numbers, a longer conversation prepared, and the particular patience of a man who believes he is right and is willing to wait the other person out. He sat across from Ruth and said the bank's position had not changed, that the lien was accruing interest at a rate that made delay expensive, and that the turkey red acreage presented a problem because the bank could not build a debt servicing plan around specialty market assumptions it could not verify against any signed contract or established price history. He said, with what he intended as respect, that what she was doing out there was sentimental, and he understood that. Jean built something here, and you want to honor that. Sentimental doesn't service a $280,000 note. Ruth slid a piece of paper across the table without responding to the word sentimental. It was a letter on Engel Mill's letterhead, 2 paragraphs, signed by Paul Engel, stating that the mill was interested in a multi-year supply arrangement for certified Turkey red wheat, minimum 4,000 bushels annually, and requesting that Ruth contact his office to discuss formal terms. Clint looked at it. He said a letter of interest was not a signed contract. She said she knew. He said the bank would require a fully executed agreement with a verified price per bushel before it could consider any modification to the current servicing expectations. She said she understood. She was going to have a signed contract by June. He left. Bess followed him to the door and watched him walk to the truck. In June of 2011, at the Reno County Wheat Growers' annual meeting in Nickerson, Bart Klein, the extension agent, stood at the podium and summarized the county's planted acreage and projected price outlook for the coming harvest. Afterward, during the informal period when farmers stood in clusters with coffee and talked, a man named Vernon Schott, who ran 400 acres 3 miles north of the Holt Place, asked Clint Barger what was going to happen with Ruth's farm. Vernon asked because he was genuinely curious and because he had heard the bank was pushing for a restructuring. Clint said, in a voice that carried farther than he probably intended, that what Ruth was doing was sentimental and that he hoped she would come around to something more practical before too long. He said it without malice. He said it as a statement of professional assessment. 5 or 6 farmers heard it. Dale often was one of them. Dale did not repeat it to Ruth directly. But the county is not large, and the coffee circles at the grain growers' meeting have long memories. And Ruth heard a version of it before the week was out. She did not respond to it. She had a contract to finish signing. Now let me tell you about Dale often, because the story is not only about Ruth. Dale farmed the section east of the Holt Place, 640 acres of mixed-class ground, and he had been one of the more respected conventional operators in that part of Reno County for 3 decades. He was 62 years old that spring, had farmed since his 20s, kept good equipment and clean accounts, and was the kind of neighbor who brought food to the house when a family was grieving and meant it. He had known Jean since 1989, and he felt genuine sorrow at Jean's death and genuine concern for Ruth. In 2009, Dale had financed $340,000 in pivot irrigation infrastructure to put 480 acres of his ground into continuous corn. The system was 11 towers and a permit well drilled to the Ogallala Aquifer, and in its first full year it produced a corn crop that drew favorable mentions at the Reno County annual meeting. Dale had crop insurance on both policies available to him, an operating line at a different bank, and a payment structure that held together comfortably as long as corn stayed above $4.50 per bushel at the elevator, and the aquifer delivered at projected rates. He sat on Ruth's porch in April of 2011, the week after Clint's second visit, and told her honestly and without any cruelty that he could not see the math working for her. He said he had run the numbers on Turkey Red against the lien balance and the interest rate, and could not find a path that didn't involve either a restructuring or a sale of some acres. He showed her the spreadsheet on his phone. He was not trying to discourage her. He was telling her what he genuinely believed, the way a good neighbor tells you something hard because they would rather you hear it from them than from a bank's legal department. She looked at the spreadsheet. She thanked him. She said Jean had run a different spreadsheet. In May of 2011, Paul Engel drove 2 hours south from Emporia in a gray sedan and spent 4 hours walking Ruth's ground. He moved methodically through the turkey red already heading in the field, pulling heads every 20 or 30 feet, cracking individual kernels between his thumb and forefinger, chewing the grain and holding it in his mouth for a moment before he moved on. He stood for a long time at the fence line where Ruth's managed fallow met the active wheat ground, looking at the soil profile where the furrow slice had been turned, noting the crumb structure and the color without saying anything. He was a compact, careful man of 51 who had been working in heritage grain procurement for 9 years and who asked, in 4 hours of walking, 2 questions. The first was how long this particular soil block had been in turkey red and managed fallow rotation without interruption. Ruth said 31 years on the home quarter, longer on the south field, which Jean's father had started. The second question was whether she intended to keep it that way. She said yes. He said he'd like to talk numbers. The contract they executed in June of 2011 specified $18.50 per certified bushel of turkey red wheat, minimum 4,000 bushels per year, delivered to the Engel elevator in Emporia for 3 years with a mutual renewal option. Ruth's first harvest that summer came in at 5,040 bushels off the 180 acres, 28 bushels to the acre, within 2 bushels of what Jean had projected in the ledger. At $18.50, that was $93,240 in gross wheat receipts. Her input costs for that 180 acres came to $14,300, covering custom harvesting, fuel, and minimal equipment maintenance. No nitrogen program because turkey red on ground rested. The way Jean had rested, it drew from an organic matter profile that had been building since 1979, and the soil tests Jean had done in 2007 showed nitrogen mineralization rates that eliminated the need for synthetic application on the wheat ground. No fungicide program, because the variety carried foliar disease resistance developed over a century of natural selection in central Kansas conditions. No herbicide costs, because Jean's fallow rotation had suppressed the weed seed bank in the wheat ground over 20 years to a density that Ruth could manage mechanically without a chemical pass. She also leased 420 acres of native pasture and managed fallow to a cattle operator out of Hutchinson named Ed Frey at $39 an acre per year, an arrangement Jean had started in 2006 and Ruth renewed without interruption. That brought in $16,380 annually. Net operating income for the first full crop year, after all farm costs and before any lien payment, was $79,100. She sent Clint Barger a payment of $42,000 in September of 2011 against the principal balance of the lien. She followed it with a payment of $22,000 in March of 2012 from the pasture lease income and her reserve. If you've watched something grow quietly that the people around you couldn't quite see yet, you know what those months were like. If you haven't, the ledger is enough. Marcus Holt came home for Thanksgiving that year. He was 29, had a business degree from Wichita State, worked in commercial insurance, and had been calling his mother every Sunday since October of 2010, with a worry that had calcified over time into something that felt close to dread. He came down the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and spent the evening at the kitchen table with Jean's notebooks and with Ruth's first-year income statement, which she had put together herself in the week after harvest. He read them carefully. He had the same methodical stillness his father had, which Ruth had noticed in him since he was in middle school. He said, after a long quiet, that the numbers worked. She said she knew. He said he hadn't expected them to work this well. He said he had run his own version of Clint's projection back in the fall of 2010, and it hadn't come out like this. She asked what he'd used for the wheat price per bushel. He looked at her. He said $5.80 because that was what the elevator was paying. She said Jean had a different number. She showed him the fourth ledger. He read the margin note with the pencil figure, and Paul Engel's name. He sat with it. He came back at Christmas. He sat at the desk with Jean's first two ledgers for most of Christmas Eve and asked Ruth questions about the soil blocks she answered from memory. He asked about the fallow intervals, about how Jean had decided which blocks to rest, and for how long, about what the soil tests in 2007 had actually shown. Ruth answered all of it. She knew it the way she knew the farmhouse layout from years of inhabiting it without being asked to describe it. He came back in February and stayed a long weekend walking the fallow blocks with Ruth. On Saturday morning, in boots Jean had left by the door, the cold, flat light moving across the ground. He stopped at the edge of a resting field and crouched and picked up a handful of soil and crumbled it between his fingers. He said he hadn't understood, when he was growing up here, what his father was doing with these rest intervals. He had thought they were idle ground. Ruth said they were the opposite of idle. Marcus stood up and looked at the field for a moment. He asked her what she needed from him. She told him to learn the soil. She said the rest would follow from that. He started driving down on Saturdays, arriving before light, and going out with her to the morning field check. And the conversation on those mornings was the kind of conversation Jean and Ruth had been having for 30 years, except that Marcus was asking the questions and Ruth was answering them. And somewhere in the first spring of that, the tone shifted. The way it shifts when someone stops asking out of politeness and starts asking because they need to know. Now let me tell you what happened in the summer of 2012, because that is the summer that decided things for the whole county. The rainfall deficit that had been building since late winter reached a breaking point in June. By the first week of July, the dryland corn across central Kansas was showing heat stress that no irrigation permit could fully offset. The Ogallala Aquifer in that part of Reno County had been drawn on heavily by a decade of expanding center pivot irrigation across multiple operations, and the static water levels in several wells were down 12 to 18 feet from their 2005 measurements. Dale's well was producing at roughly 70% of its original rate, and to maintain adequate pressure across 11 towers, he was running pumps at a cost 30% above what his operating budget had assumed. His corn suffered a 62% yield reduction in 2012. His crop insurance covered losses above the coverage threshold, but the deductible and the policy ceiling left an uncovered shortfall of $89,000 against a payment schedule that had been calibrated for normal production years and had no cushion. He made the September payment from his operating line. He could not make the December payment from anywhere that did not create a new problem. In September of 2012, the week after Clint Barger received Ruth's third principal payment, Clint's bank also received a call from Dale Offen's restructuring file, transferred from the other bank in Hutchinson that held Dale's operating line. Clint did not work with Dale directly, but he knew the situation the way anyone in a county-level lending network knows the shape of the distress moving through an agricultural community when a drought year lands on a debt structure with no slack in it. There were 11 farms in Reno County in similar conversations that fall. The extension agent, Bart Klein, sent a note to the state extension office in November saying the 2012 season had exposed structural debt vulnerability in operations that had expanded irrigation infrastructure. In 2008 and 2009, and had not built adequate reserve against yield failure. It was a careful, accurate note, and it said nothing that Gene Holt had not already understood when he declined to expand into irrigated corn the year Dale made that decision. By October, Dale was in a restructuring meeting. He told Ruth about it that November over coffee on her porch, in a flat, factual voice, the way farmers in that part of the world report hard weather. He said he was going to have to let some acres go. He said 240 would bring him back to even. He did sell 240 acres at auction in March of 2013. Good ground, Class II ground his father had broken in 1947. He got a fair price because the ground was genuinely good, and the bidders knew it. He was not destroyed. He still farmed the remaining 400 acres and maintained the pivot on 300 of them. The auction lot drew buyers from 3 counties, and Bart Klein wrote a summary in the Extension newsletter about the 2012 losses. And the county average dry land corn yield, he cited, was 41 bushels per acre against a projected 112. Ruth's Turkey Red had come off in late June, 3 weeks before the worst of the heat arrived, the way winter wheat always does in Kansas. Harvest ran 26 bushels to the acre on the 180, slightly below the first year because a dry spring compresses the heading window even in deep-rooted varieties. 4,680 bushels at $18.50. $86,580 in gross wheat receipts. Pasture lease income unchanged at $16,380. Input costs slightly lower than year 1 because Ruth had selected and stored her own seed from the first harvest and eliminated the certified seed purchase, saving $4,200 in seed cost. Net operating income for year 2 of the Engel contract was $94,620. She had been applying lien payments twice a year, every year, the way Gene had applied attention to the ground, methodical, patient, without drama. After the March 2012 payment, the balance had stood at $194,000. After the September 2012 payment, it was $148,000. She made another payment in November, the day the Turkey Red proceeds cleared her account. In December, she called Clint. He came out on a Tuesday morning, dry and cold, the kind of Kansas December that smells like frozen dirt and has no forgiveness in it. Ruth handed him the lien statement at the front door before he had taken his coat off. He stood in the entry reading it. Bess moved around his legs once, testing the newcomer the way she always did, and went back to her spot on the rug by the door. He sat down at the table. He set the paper in front of him and looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something when you are adjusting what you thought you knew to account for what is in front of you. $61,247.18. He said he had not thought this was possible in this time frame. She said Gene had thought it was. He had worked out the timeline in the fourth ledger in 2008, 2 years before the stroke, running the Engel price against the projected yield and the input cost reduction from the organic matter profile and the weed suppression. And the number had come out close enough to what actually happened that Ruth had folded the page over when she found it. Clint said he hadn't known about the ledger. She said she knew. He sat quietly for a moment. The statement was still face up in front of him. He said in a different register than he had used at this table before that he had still called it sentimental out at the grain growers' meeting the previous summer. He said he thought she should know he had said that. Ruth said she had heard. He said he had been wrong about that. She said she knew. He sat with that. Then he asked how the rotation actually worked. The soil inputs, the weed suppression. He said he had underwritten agricultural loans for 16 years and had never seen input costs this low on wheat ground outside of a certified organic premium program. He said he would like to understand what Jean had been doing. She got Jean's first ledger from the shelf, the one dated 1994, with the block letter header on the first page. She set it in front of Clint. She said she put coffee on. He was still at the table an hour later when she came back to check, reading the early pages the way a person reads something that is making them see something they should have seen sooner. $61,247.18. That was what remained on a lien that Clint Barger had calculated would take a conventional operator 15 years to service. It had taken 26 months without selling a single acre, without an operating line of credit, without a restructuring agreement, and without any approach a standard agricultural lending template would have recognized as viable when Ruth sat down across from Clint in October of 2010. Paul Engel renewed the contract in January of 2013, a 3-year extension at $19.10 per bushel, a price he revised upward after informing Ruth that an artisan bakery in Chicago had placed Engel's turkey red flour on their sourcing specification sheet, and that demand from the specialty baking market in Kansas City had increased 31% in the previous 12 months. He said he expected it to continue. Marcus resigned from the insurance firm in Wichita in April of 2013 and moved back to the farmhouse. He took over the seeding that fall. He handled the Engel delivery the following summer. By the end of his second season on the ground, he could walk the soil blocks and tell Ruth which quadrants were ready for wheat and which needed another rest year, reading the color and the structure and the weed pressure the way Jean had read them, the way Ruth had read them alongside Jean for 3 decades. He had filled a notebook and a half. He had also started corresponding with a plant geneticist at Kansas State who was documenting heritage grain variety trials, and the Holt Farm's soil and yield records going back to 1994 had become part of a data set the university was using to model long-term outcomes of reduced input heritage grain systems. 6 neighbors came to Ruth in the spring of 2014, separately and in pairs, asking about Turkey Red and about the Engel relationship and about the fallow rotation. Vernon Schott, the man who had overheard Clint's comment at the grain growers meeting in 2011, came on a Saturday morning with his son and sat at Ruth's table for 2 hours, taking notes in a spiral-bound notebook that looked, she noticed, similar to the ones Jean had used. He asked detailed questions about the rest intervals and the seed selection protocol, and he asked about the soil test methodology and what specifically to look for in the organic matter readings before committing a block to the variety. She answered him the same way Jean had answered her when she had asked those questions over the years, plainly, with numbers, without impatience. She gave each of them Paul Engel's contact information, a paper copy of Jean's soil rest schedule, and a quantity of certified seed from her own stock, enough for a trial planting on a single field. She did not charge for any of it. She told them plainly that the rotation required 3 full years before the soil structure would support the variety the way it needed to be supported, and that the first year's yields would likely disappoint them, and they needed to be patient and not abandon it before they had given it time. 3 of them planted that fall. 2 stayed with it through the initial period and were in a supply conversation with Engel Mills by 2016. Clint Barger attended a Heritage Grain Symposium at Kansas State in the spring of 2014, the first of its kind the university had organized. He had received an invitation through a contact at the extension office and had almost not gone, and then had gone. He told Ruth about it at the Lien closing in March, standing in the parking lot of the county building in Hutchinson. He said there were farmers at the symposium growing turkey red and other heritage varieties and doing well with specialty market contracts, and that their balance sheets looked unlike anything in his standard agricultural lending templates. He said he thought his bank was going to need a different underwriting framework for this category of operation. He said he wanted to talk with her again when she had time, and with Marcus, about what a proper soil and market analysis would look like for the kind of farm the Holt place had become. Ruth said she thought Jean's ledgers would be a reasonable place to start. Dale often came to the farmhouse in February of 2014, 3 weeks before the lien cleared, and sat at Ruth's kitchen table and asked about the rotation. He had 240 acres where the pivot was no longer economic to run, and he was thinking about what to do with them. Ruth spent 2 hours at the table with him and Jean's second ledger, and she walked him through the rest intervals and the seed selection and the soil preparation. And she told him what Paul Engel would need to see in terms of variety certification and delivery specification. Dale took notes. He shook Ruth's hand at the door and said that he wished he had asked Jean about this when Jean was still alive to be asked. Ruth said Jean would have told him. The lien cleared on March 14th, 2014, 40 months after Jean's funeral, at a small office in a county building in Hutchinson. Marcus drove. Ruth sat in the passenger seat with Jean's fourth ledger on her lap. Bess was in the truck bed. The clerk handed Ruth the release document, and Ruth folded it once and put it in the ledger, in the pocket inside the back cover that Jean had used for receipts and phone numbers. And they drove home. Ruth changed out of her good coat and went to look at the turkey red coming up in the home quarter. The green was just showing across the field. The variety's wide, flat leaves different from modern wheat, even at this early stage. The same look it had had in Jean's father's time and his grandfather's time. The look of a grain that had been earning its place in Kansas soil for 130 years. Bess walked the headland beside her. There is a kind of knowledge that does not reduce to a column. It accumulates over seasons and soil tests and late-evening conversations and margins in notebooks, and it is the knowledge of a particular system in a particular place over a sufficient span of time. It cannot be generalized at scale, which is exactly why the systems built for scale have no category for it. A bank underwrites based on what a template farm of this type and this acreage in this county normally produces. A county extension office advises based on what produces the highest yield per acre across the regional average. Neither template contains the specific information that Jean Holt spent 31 years accumulating about 180 acres of Kansas ground and what a century-old wheat variety could do on it if given what it needed. Clint Barger was not cynical. He was not careless. He had seen farms in trouble, and he knew what the usual outcomes looked like, and his model for the Holt place, given the information available to him in October of 2010, was a reasonable model. He was wrong about the outcome because his model did not contain Jean's notebooks and because no model built to serve 100 clients could contain the particular depth that one person's sustained attention to one piece of ground accumulates over decades. The model measured what was easy to count. It called the rest sentimental. What Jean knew and Ruth knew and what Marcus spent 3 years learning to see for himself is that the things a spreadsheet cannot price are frequently the things that hold. A variety selected by a century of central Kansas winters for exactly the conditions of central Kansas winters. A soil given sufficient rest to rebuild what it gives. A relationship with a buyer who needs something the commodity market cannot consistently supply. These are not advantages that scale. They are advantages that compound, slowly and without announcement, in one place, with one farmer's attention, over time enough to matter. The Holt place did not compete with Dale Offen's pivot operation. It withdrew from the competition. It found the space outside the commodity template, where the template did not apply, and it operated in that space without apology, and when the summer came that broke the template, it was already clear of the wreckage. Bess lay in the dirt at the field's edge that March afternoon, watching Ruth walk the rows, her ears forward, working the only ground she knew. Jean's fourth ledger was on the corner of the desk at home. The pencil note about Paul Engel and the 1850 figure was still there in the margin. The way things are that were written down by someone who intended to act on them and ran out of time. Marcus had started writing in the margins around it. What is patient enough to belong to a place tends, in the end, to remain.